That does actually open up this question of can you fulfill the obligation of attending Sunday Mass by live streaming? The answer is no, although it's a very good thing to have the live streaming if it helps a person sanctify the Sunday by following his or her missal at home and able to get to Mass. So it's not the same thing as attending Mass in person, but it can be a great aid to sanctifying the Sunday, because if a person cannot get to Mass for some serious reason, such as confinement, lockdown, and all the rest of it, big fines or whatever, there still remains the obligation to sanctify the Sunday, or Holy Day of obligation, and this in two ways. One, by refraining from servile works, and the other precisely by special prayers, for example, following the Missal, some prayers over and above, let's say, the usual prayers. The church law precisely says to sanctify, tells us that to sanctify the Sunday, we do this by going to Holy Mass. You can't get to Mass, there's still the obligation to sanctify the Sunday through prayer and abstention from servile works. So one of the criteria for attending Mass, for fulfilling the obligation, fulfilling, yes, the obligation to hear Mass, to attend Mass, is to be physically present. So, of course, live streaming, normally speaking, you're not physically present. Having said that, in Advrier, the Dominican monastery there, Dominican Priory, as there are so many people at the Sunday Mass, normally speaking, and their priory church is not huge, so they set up screens, or at least a screen, a big screen, outside in the narthex, where people besides can follow the Mass, and there they are actually following Mass, attending Mass, because the Mass is in the immediate vicinity. It's just they are following the actual progress of the Mass via a screen, but they're following the Mass itself by being physically present, even if they're just outside the church in the narthex, the entranceway. And that's another thing, to be physically present, you must be, say, moral theologians, within 60 feet of the congregation. So if there's a large gathering of faithful for Mass and you find yourselves outside, if you're attached to the congregation following the Mass, and perhaps you can hear the bells of the church and so on, that you are indeed following Mass. If you are outside the church for another reason, and there was no large group of people outside the church for some big occasion, let's say you had, I don't know, nursing a baby or whatever, you must be within 60 feet of the Mass, of the church, in order to fulfill the obligation. So we're saying to people here last Sunday that a bit like this priest in the States, if people cannot physically get into a church, then perhaps they could drive in front of the church door where the true Mass is being offered, and even from outside the church in their car, follow Mass in their missal, etc. That's possible. Once again, it's we're not quite there. Although for confessions and so on, we've said to people, if they are obstructed coming to a private place of worship, they're not to hesitate to say to the priest, well, as they're still allowed to go shopping, then to ask the priest if he could meet them in the car park of the local supermarket, and they sitting in their car, if they could manage to park next to the priest's car and rolling down the windows, could make a confession in that way and still being within the regulations of being out to go shopping, but in fact making the most of that possibility to receive this confession. So there we go. Going back to
is it the same for confession then? You have to be present with the priest for a confession?
Yes, it is the same. It's a good point. It is the same. There must be proximity to the priest for confession. Now, from memory, it could even be further away than 60 feet. I have in mind, but I haven't checked this one up, it could be as much as 200 yards. And I say this because if, for example, a priest were present at some sort of disaster, like an aeroplane crashing or a bus full of people bursting into flames or whatever, from a distance, from memory, if I'm not mistaken, even as far away as 200 yards, the priest could give at least conditional absolution. In fact, general absolution is one of the few occasions traditionally allowed when a priest could give collective general absolution in an emergency when people could not precisely possibly have individual auricular confession. And the priest would give this in the event that people were making an act of contrition and hoping, praying that there'd be a priest nearby giving an absolution. So if I'm not mistaken, the distance there is greater than that required for attending Mass. In the life of, is it Father Damien of Molokai, because of course being the chaplain to the lepers in their total confinement, he himself could not leave the island of Molokai and set foot on any other place. So what he would do for his own confession, he would row out towards a passing ship at a prearranged time when there would be a priest on board the ship, and he, Father Damien, would shout up from his rowing boat his sins to the priest on deck, sum up to the embarrassment or confusion of passengers on the liner, and would receive absolution. And that was certainly at some distance, but I'm sure within the limits. So it's not possible to receive absolution online. Having said that, of course, sometimes doing things online can help a person to elicit an act of contrition. And if it's an act of perfect contrition, of course, that has also the effects of a wiping away grave sin, all sin, grave sin. It was Pius XII, if I'm not mistaken, who allowed blessings, for example, the papal blessing to be given over the radio. So that's can the priest give a blessing over the? We do it sometimes. It's true. I've not looked into the actual technicalities of this, but we do give the blessing over the internet or the radio or even the telephone. That's true. I guess as an extension of what the Pope allowed for himself over the radio, rightly or wrongly, in fact. So as I say, live streaming can be helpful to sanctify the Sunday, even though it does not itself constitute assistance at Mass. Of course, one let's call it a possible disadvantage to live streaming is in the modern church anyway, when people are being told, to attend masses through live streaming, which is once again inaccurate and confusing. If people get into the habit of doing this, being not armchair generals, but armchair faithful, think, okay, when on a Sunday, I just sit at home with my coffee or something stronger. I put the TV on or the computer and I watch the Mass, and that's as good as being in the church and all the rest of it. Of course, that would be misleading and erroneous. And but that's obviously something. That's why it's good to explain the real situation.
Going back to the thing about absolution, if say the supermarket scenario, you can't actually physically hear the priest because you can't have the windows down for whatever reason, or you're slightly too far apart. I know you can't give absolution over the telephone, but if you've got physical proximity to the supermarket car park, could you be on one mobile phone and the other one, but within sort of the relevant distance? Would that be okay?
Yes, it could work. It actually occasionally happens when the priest goes to visit people in prison. And I know in the States where, so you'd go to the local jail and you would not be able to, you'd see the person via the perspex screen. You'd pick up the intercom to speak to the person, and if he were a penitent, the priest would hear the person's confession over the intercom system in the booth, the perspex booth, and give absolution through the perspex partition, and would indeed be lawful and valid because there was a proximity there to make the confession. Also, if a confession cannot be made in an oral way, it can be possible also to write down the sins. So you pretend it's your shopping list, which you give to the priest, and he reads it and gives the penance and absolution. That's also possible as well. Indeed, if a person could not even in any way, shape or form make what's called an auricular confession, orally making their confession, but if they showed a sign, they wanted to have it, they were sorry for their sins, they wanted to receive the sacrament, they perhaps showed their contrition by striking discreetly their chest as a further confiteor, and the priest could give absolution, because what makes what's essential and what's in confession is the actual contrition for sin and the words of absolution. So sometimes people are going, for example, in times gone by to the scaffold, like in the French Revolution. Sisters of Compiègne, for example, are singing the Veni Creator, as I recall, in the cart behind the horse or the ox being taken to the scaffold, and the priest in the corner of the street with his hat pulled over his eyes and in disguise. But the sisters noticed him. He raised his hand, gave absolution. The sisters realized they'd received the sacrament of penance. So it can be done in that way also.